The Russians have managed to make significant advances all across the front line, with the most important ones taking place within the city of Pokrovsk, the full capture of Rodynske in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, and the capture of the industrial area in the southeastern outskirts of Belgorod, with an additional push in the direction of Kostyantynivka, where the Russians have been geolocated within the city itself, with additional advances to the north and south of Siversk. Russian forces detected in the eastern outskirts of Lyman, the significant advances taking place within the Kupiansk direction, additional advances along the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, the recapture of the entirety of Oleksivka, and many more advances all across the front line. In this one specifically, the main focus is in the Pokrovsk direction, where the Russians managed to gain control over additional sections here in the north and south of the city. In the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain full control over Rodynske with 100% full control over the city. The Russians now have an open road to the intersection just to the south of it. This allowed the Russians to cut off the final intersection, which is the final highway that connects to Pokrovsk and Belgorod. Cutting off this intersection will allow the Russians to have operational control, where they have direct fire control over any road in and out of the cities of Belgorod and Pokrovsk. This significantly complicates any withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces from Belgorod and Pokrovsk. At the same time, it also allows the Russians to continue offensive operations, to connect their forces in the north and the south, and to physically encircle all of remaining Ukrainian forces within Belgorod and Pokrovsk, which means up to 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers risk encirclement in Belgorod and the surrounding areas, not to mention what remains within Pokrovsk, and this also increases the pressure on Ukrainian forces operating on the flanks of these cities. Gaining control over Belgorod and Pokrovsk would allow the Russians to gain control over two cities, which combined had a pre-war population of approximately 120,000 people. Rodynske also had a pre-war population of about 10,000 people, which adds to these recent captures and future captures 130,000 pre-war population. This is a significant amount of urban areas through which the Russian forces can be stationed, and equipment as well as logistics be stationed within these cities, allowing them to operate as logistical hubs, not to mention the highways that are connected to Pokrovsk, which will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations in many separate directions. With control over the highway intersection, which is Pokrovsk itself, they can supply their forces operating within Kostyantynivka, in the north towards Dobropilya, and in the west in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Speaking of Kostyantynivka, the Russians were geolocated within the city itself, where the Russians, following the capture of the Dacha area, started storming the fortifications of the Ukrainians on the outskirts of the city, and with this, the Russians have now pushed through these fortifications and have been geolocated within the city. This geolocation confirms the Russian presence on the eastern parts of the city within the residential area, where the Russians are here fighting to get a foothold within the city itself. The objective of the Russians is to cut off the highway which connects down south towards Ivanopilya, where the Russians just recently captured Pleshivka and are pushing the Ukrainians out towards Ivanopilya. With the supply route cut off in the north, the Russians would be able to quickly gain control over Ivanopilya, allowing for additional highway, residential areas, and the railway to connect to the Russian forces operating within the city, allowing for a foothold to be obtained within it from the southeastern direction. Back to Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over the eastern parts of the industrial area. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians continued offensive operations on the northern parts of the railway line. Securing the remaining parts of the industrial area secures the Russian control over the E50 highway and their positions in the western parts of the city. As for Belgorod, the Russians managed to gain control over the industrial area in the southeastern outskirts of the city. With this, they've consolidated their positions within the city and continued offensive operations in the westward direction to gain control over the southern parts of Belgorod up towards the apartment complex area, which then encircles what remains of Ukrainian forces within the Sumy, Lysivka, and the surrounding fortifications in that section of the front line. It is currently undergoing a rapid collapse of the Ukrainian positions within Belgorod and Pokrovsk, where their advancements on the flanks for the Russians allows them to put immense pressure on the Ukrainian forces defending this section of the front line and puts them at a major risk of encirclement. To the southwest of this, the Russians managed to gain control over the settlement of Slahoda and the forest lines to the east of the Yanchur River as they reached the northern outskirts of Krasnoyarsk. With this, the Russians continued offensive operations on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River to gain full control of it, as well as on the western bank of the Yanchur River, where they're advancing alongside it to gain full control over the river line and expand their bridgehead across the river line. This is in combination with the recent advances along the second and first lines of defense to gain control over the fortifications and cut off the northern highway, which leads into Huliaipole, and gaining control over the eastern road, which leads into Huliaipole from the east. In the northern direction, north of Kostyantynivka, the Russians advanced both to the north and south of Siversk. In the southern flank of Siversk, the Russians are expanding the zone of control west of Vyemka, fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, as well as the forest lines along the railway line. Russians are here clearing the eastern flank of Svanivka to push in the direction of the town itself to gain full control of it through a push from the south, where they are looking to gain a foothold within Svanivka by pushing along the railway line and the residential area. And with the push from the eastern flank as well, they're looking to cut off the supplies heading into Svanivka from the north, as well as put pressure on the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the southern flank of Siversk. As for the northern flank of Siversk, the Russians have gained full control over Rodynske here along the river line, and with this they have secured what remains on the southern flank of the Luhansk region, and it also allows the Russians to continue their efforts on gaining full control over the northern flank of Siversk, where only a small portion of the parts north of the railway line remains under Ukrainian control. This increased pressure by the Russians along the Bakhmutovka River is to outflank Siversk from the northern direction, cut off the highway which connects to Lyman itself, and connect with the forces operating in the south of Siversk, completely bypassing the town. To the northwest of this, the Russians continued offensive operations along the fortifications east of Lyman, getting control over 2 additional fortified positions, and also reaching the outskirts of Lyman. According to Deep State Map, the Russian forces were detected on the eastern outskirts of Lyman, already operating within the city, while the Ukrainians are responding by striking their positions with FPV drones. So with this, the Russians have gained a foothold within Lyman and Kostyantynivka on the same day, as they've managed to fully capture Rodynske, putting their forces operating within Mirnorod and Pokrovsk under extreme risk of encirclement. The capture of these fortifications along the forest patch area leads to Russians to have control over the majority of the area between the Sherbets River line and Lyman, with no fortifications between the Russian forces and the city itself, allowing them to start the battle over the city. And with this, the Russians continue offensive operations from the north, east, and northwest, where they're looking to cut off what remains of the supply lines leading into the city and to gain full control of it. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain control over 2 fortifications here to the east of Zahritsove. Following the capture of the settlement, the Russians have been initiating offensive operations against the Ukrainian fortifications here in the area for a long time, where they've mainly focused on striking those positions with artillery and FPV drones. But with the capture of Zahritsove, they managed to push through to gain control over the fortifications, and this opens the road for the Russians to gain control over what remains under Ukrainian control north of the rail line here southwest of Losova, gain control of these fortifications, and with their foothold in the southern flank of the next line of defense, the Russians can put the Ukrainian fortifications in a pincer maneuver, attacking them from the north and the south. On the northern flank of Kupiansk, the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks to attempt to cut off the line connection between the Russian forces within Kupiansk itself and on the northern flank. This geolocated footage confirms Ukrainian presence to the northeast of Kupiansk, where they were attempting to cut off the Russian supply lines by regaining control of the positions near Radkivka. From what we see from the footage itself, the Ukrainians pushed through from the south of Radkivka along the road up towards the energy area near Holyovka, where they looked to disembark their infantry and cut off the supplies and attack the supplies of the Russian forces moving through the northern flank of Kupiansk. However, Russian FPV drone operators managed to strike all of these Ukrainian disembarkments. As we saw with the footage itself, the Ukrainian forces that managed to push through were attacked by the Russian forces operating in the area, and the Russians managed to re-secure their flank. According to Russian sources, this is the second wave of Ukrainian attempts to counterattack on the northern flank of Kupiansk. They'll continue to do so as long as they see a gap in the Russian defenses. The Russians are here counterattacking to attempt to stabilize the situation and prevent further breakthroughs by the Ukrainians, which can endanger the supply of the Russian forces operating within the city. However, with the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces that remained within the city, the Russians have consolidated their positions within it. Unless the Ukrainian forces make a drastic move, it is difficult for them to defeat the Russian grouping within the city and encircle them, as the Russians can now divert their forces back to the north and in the different directions to secure the flanks of the city. In conclusion, these counterattack attempts is simply too little, too late. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain control over Belgorod, as well as several forest lines and forest patches in the vicinity. Following the capture of Rodynske and with the new capture of Belgorod, the Russians are securing their positions along the border between the Belgorod and Kurakhove regions, where they're looking to connect their forces operating within the vicinity of Kupiansk with the ones along the border area. The Russians started with a push along the border to gain control over Milove, from which they expanded in several directions, took a break, and then expanded along the border. The Russians are here working alongside the border to gain as much as an advantage as possible with the shorter supply lines, where the Ukrainians would be extending their supply lines to support their forces with supplies coming from Western nations all the way to the eastern outskirts of the front line. That is why the Russians have in their interest to have some more operations along the border area. It also widens the front line, forcing Ukrainians to send reinforcements and supplies to the eastern outskirts of the front line, rather than other areas that are under more pressure, such as Vovchansk, Kupiansk, Lyman, Kostyantynivka, Pokrovsk, and Belgorod, which are all larger towns or cities which act as logistical hubs in their local front lines. The Russians capturing these significantly improves the positions of their forces in the different sectors of the front line. In the Sumy region, the Russians managed to regain full control over Kurakhove following the Ukrainian attempts to regain control over the settlement by attacking it from the western and southern directions. With this, the Russians have recaptured the settlement in its entirety and further secured the defense of their section of the front line. The Ukrainians have been attempting localized counterattacks for a while, regaining control over Counterattacks, most importantly, but also Andrivka to the southwest of Kurakhove. But following this, they have struggled to regain control over Vereshchina, Novokilevka, and Oleksivka, which the Russians have continuously managed to recapture with their own counterattacks, which leads the Ukrainian forces into positions where they're taking a lot of losses for no real gain. In comparison, the Russians are making daily advances on the eastern and southern section of the front line, managing to put immense pressure on larger cities under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians still have a limited reserve that is dedicated to offensive operations. However, they are currently incapable of launching a larger offensive such as what we saw in the Kursk region, not to mention the risks that would be involved in such an operation, as the Russians have even more forces in reserve, not to mention the immense pressure on these larger cities in the Donetsk region, which remains under Ukrainian control. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.